Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to welcome members, our witnesses, and those joining us online, the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee's 21st meeting of 2020. We have received apologies this morning from Rhoda Grant MSP, and we are joined in her time. You've joined this committee as a substitute member. Can I invite you to declare any relevant interests? Alex. Alex, sorry, your microphone wasn't on, so if you'd like to start again.
Yeah. Thanks, Convener. I would refer to my parliamentary list of interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'd like you to turn us to the agenda. Agenda item 1 is our decision to take items 5 and 6 in private. So I will pause for any objections, and please let me know, raise your hand or indicate if you have any problems. Thank you. I'll take Simon's as agreement, so that is agreed. So if I can turn you to our second item of business, which is consideration of the proposal by the Scottish Government to the UK Government legislating using the powers under the European Union withdrawal 2018. The UK statutory instrument proposal relates to the prohibition on quantitative restrictions and equivalent measures (cessation) EU exit regulations 2020. The Scottish Government has given this notification a Category A label. This means that it considers it to be minor and technical in detail and ensures continuity of the law. Further detail on the purpose of the proposed statutory instrument is outlined in the committee's papers. So we have a number of things to do. The committee is being invited to consider whether it is content for these issues to be dealt with by statutory instrument laid at Westminster, and whether a Category A classification is appropriate for this statutory instrument. So I'm going to invite all of you to comment if you've got anything that you actually have an issue with. So can I ask if anybody wishes to speak on this? Andy Whiteman.
Thank you very much, Convener. I don't have any problem with the substance of the proposal in relationship to the to repealing these EU measures, given that from the end of December will no longer be subject to EU law. However, I do have a view on the fact that the Scottish Government has made this Category A. I think this would be more appropriate as Category B. This is not minor and technical. These are direct rights that people in the UK have that are being removed. So it'd be better to be Category B. I also have concerns about the timing of this instrument. We basically have to deal with it today. The Scottish Government is expected to respond by the 27th of June and is expected to be laid in Westminster on the 1st of July. This is not really acceptable for an instrument that doesn't need to be enforced until the end of December, and I'm very keen that we stress that to the Scottish Government, because we're not going to be able to deal with these instruments properly if we don't have enough time to properly consider them. I also think we should be asking the Scottish Government some questions. It argues, for example, that retaining the measures could disadvantage some companies. I'm not clear how that would be the case. I'm also wondering whether the Scottish continuity provisions, and particularly the ability to keep pace with EU legislation, might be used to ensure that the substantive provisions can be kept up to date in devolved areas. So a few points there, but substantively, I think we should be content to let Westminster deal with this.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I see Richard Lyle would like to speak as well. Richard, can I bring you in?
Thank you, Convener. Like Andy Whiteman, I think Category B may instead be more appropriate on the basis that the proposed SI would remove a very significant part of EU trade law. And I'm very displeased in this instance, the Scottish Parliament received this notification late in the afternoon of the 16th of June. We did not get this in the timescale, and today is the 23rd of June. I think we should record our displeasure that we have been asked, when we generally get 28 days or more, we should ask for send a letter to record our concern and displeasure at being asked to do this within a week. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. I've no other requests to comment. Can I just seek silence as agreement with the comments that have been made in terms of the timings of the notification and the concerns around the categorisation, that it maybe should have been B, not A. So I'll take silence as agreement. If anybody wishes to disagree or comment, please let me know. Okay. Right, I'll take that as agreement, and on that basis then, can I propose that I write to the letter to approve the giving of consent, but I will in the letter highlight the members' concerns about the timing and the category, and hopefully that will at least alert them to our concerns and for future SIs. Is everybody happy with that? Again, I'll take silence as agreement. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll write to the Minister shortly. In that case, can I turn us to the next agenda item? And this is consider the proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating in relation to the Insolvency (Amendment) (EU Exit) Regulations 2019, Amendment Regulations 2020. So this proposal is made under the European Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020, and as with the previous statutory instrument, the Scottish Government has given this a Category A classification, and further details were outlined in the committee's papers. We did have some conversation about this last week, the committee to consider the notification and to decide whether it is content for these issues to be dealt with by statutory instrument laid at Westminster. So if any member isn't content for these matters to be dealt with by Westminster, can they request to speak? I know, Andy, you've requested to speak again, so can I go to Andy Whiteman, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm content with Westminster UK Parliament dealing with these regulations. I'm also pleased that, in contrast to the others, we've had the proper timescales to consider these, and hence we had some conversation about this last week. I'm also pleased the Scottish Government is, despite the fact there isn't a protocol in place between the Scottish Government and Parliament to cover EU exit-related instruments, it's using a protocol that was developed for the under the deficiencies power in the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. Is using that protocol. It's following that protocol, which I think is very, very helpful to keep Parliament appraised of and give Parliament proper time to scrutinise these requests for SIs to be dealt with in the UK. And the notification itself is very specific and detailed and helps understand exactly what it's about. So happy to agree with the proposal.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. I haven't had any indication that anybody else wants to speak. So can I assume, unless I hear otherwise, that the committee is content to agree to this SI? Okay, thank you very much. Right, now we can turn to our main item of business this morning, which is to take evidence on the Heat Network Scotland Bill. And I'm pleased to welcome our first panel of witnesses. We have Nicola Mahmood, Senior Business Development Manager at ENGIE, Owen Meyer, Director for Scotland and the North, Vattenfall UK, and Claire Mack, Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for giving your time today to us. So I'm going to move straight to members unless anybody on the panel specifically wants to say anything as an opening. Haven't had an indication as such, so I'll remind everybody if you could keep your questions and answers succinct and give broadcasting staff a few minutes just to make sure your microphone is on before you begin to speak. So I'm going to go first of all to Alison Harris for the first question. So Alison Harris, please.
Good morning, panel. I would like to ask you, what involvement did you have in the development of this bill, and are you content with the consultation process and the development of the bill?
Right, would you like to volunteer to take that first question of our witnesses? Right, okay, I've got Nicola, so we'll go to Nicola, and I think Owen was indicating as well after Nicola. So Nicola first.
Thank you. I've sat on the Scottish Government Working Group, so we've been heavily involved in the development of the bill, and we're delighted, excuse me, we're delighted to see much of the recommendations and feedback that we've given to the government officials in the bill. We widely welcome the bill. We think that it's a good step forward in terms of helping to put consumer confidence behind heat networks and to help us with the growth of this particular market.
Yeah, grand. Maguire?
Hi, Alison. Yeah, I'd like to echo Nicola's sentiments that yes, when we were involved in the run-up to this bill, and we're very happy to see some of the key recommendations coming through. We think it's a long overdue bill, and actually it provides a very nice framework to allow for wider investment in heat networks towards decarbonisation of heat. I think that there's a couple of devils in the detail for a lot of these things, as I'm sure the audience is well aware, but the direction of travel is very broadly very positive.
Thank you.
Okay, Claire, do you wish to comment before I go back to Alison? Claire Mack?
Yep. Hi, hello, convener. Yeah, just very similar sentiments that we very much welcome the introduction of the Heat Networks Bill. It's very timely as well because we can see really strong capability for this to help us with the green economic recovery that we've been talking about here in Scotland, as district heat networks are very much a proven and low regret solution that with the right policies can help support decarbonisation as well as economic growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alison?
Okay, thank you, panel, for those answers. But would you say, is there anything that has actually been omitted that was considered in the consultation? And is there anything that you think should actually be included with this bill?
Will I go
again?
first?
Should we go around? Sorry, Claire. Okay, Claire, go first then.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, we think largely the bill is an excellent foundation. It's an absolutely excellent foundation to get the infrastructure in place. But this technology doesn't have the same consumer demand as its driver as certain other technological rollouts perhaps that we've seen in terms of infrastructure. So if you think about perhaps broadband or even something like digital television, it's different. It doesn't have that same consumer demand running behind it. So we need to create that to make this viable, to ensure that we can gain the kind of wider benefits of the heat network rollout that we're about to see in Scotland. And there are a few things that can be done in there to make a sort of robust and proportionate licensing regime, including some regulations around obligations to connect, workarounds about permitting with local authorities, and in creating zones in order to create specific areas, although to help strengthen that kind of network assessment process and bring forward specific zones where we can start to develop heat networks.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that? Owen, was that you? Yes. So we'll go at Owen and then Nicola. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so Alison, just in relation to some of the areas where we think that we could increase some levels of focus, I think in particular looking at consumer protection and customers, but I do understand that there are issues around development and powers that might curtail sort of the Scottish ambitions as to enforce those levels of protection for the consumer. I think that there's some issues around, and again, this is the first pass, but looking at what Claire mentioned around sort of the obligations to connect, as well as and also the heat network zones. So looking at how those would be enforced and what levels of obligations there would be on local authorities to actually not just produce a study, which I think actually looking at the developments down south, where you see that BEIS and the Haitian policies have resulted in a lot of just studies, but very, very little action. I think that there's definitely more of a drive from us to be able to see more material obligations on local authorities to push forward with those heat network zones where appropriate and where suitable.
Thank you.
Alice, sorry, we're going to Nicola now. Nicola.
Right, thank you. I think the only thing that we think could possibly strengthen the bill further would be to look at the potential of a stronger transition period, where we've already got existing networks in Scotland, and we're currently developing one in Edinburgh. The investment cases have been made based on the current technologies, and the bill itself doesn't currently give protection in terms of the existing investment cases for those specific networks. So we think it's a very strong start, but we would like, if it's possible, to see a better definition around the transition from where we are just now into the bill and the obligations that will bring.
Thank you. Alison, do you want to come back?
No, convener, I'm happy, thank you.
Okay. Can I move to Richard Lyle then, please? Richard.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. Could I ask you, in regards to the low carbon heat networks, can you remind the committee what shared group loops are and how extensively they might be used in low carbon heat networks?
Okay, shall we go to Owen first, then Nicola, and then Claire, please?
No. Hi, Richard. Yeah, it's one of those nice technical questions that how long is a piece of string? But very succinctly, what is a shared ground loop? Ultimately, that is a technology which is looking at extraction of low-grade heat from the ground. And what you can end up doing, the shared element, is that you can apply or put several different individual heat pumps on that shared ground loop, which allows for various different nuances of heat transfer to be used. But really, what it looks to try and do is use a ground source heat pump, in essence, to increase the performance of a heat pump, which reduces the cost of that production of that low carbon heat. And when you look at the shared element, there's two ways of that shared element can be. It can be a shared element of sharing for a communal source, where you have a ground source heat pump which provides heat to a large number of individual blocks. So that would be classed as a shared loop. Or if you've got a closed loop system, you can have things such as ambient temperature loops, where you might have one building which might require cooling, can actually sort of then be transferred over to another building that requires heat. So it's a case of balancing demand and supply.
Nicola, do you have anything to add to that one?
I think my colleagues made an excellent summary of that particular technology. I don't have anything to add.
And Claire?
I think more just to add a kind of wider point around that, which Owen was talking about, which is that to underpin this and to really drive this in the most effective way possible for Scotland. And there's lots of different outcomes that we would want from this, not just reducing carbon emissions. It would be to try and drive inclusive economic growth, and it would be to try and drive down fuel poverty in any way that we possibly can. And I think the building assessment tools and the information that we get as we gather, as we go along this journey, are really, really important to work out how we can aggregate demand in the way that Owen just explained, and to make sure that we can actually drive a really strong partnership between not just industry within an area, but domestic heat demand within an area, and try and work out if there are opportunities to attract particular industries who are particularly heat intensive into an area, and what then can be done through that to try and serve that domestic market through heat transfer and other options of that nature.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. Richard?
Yeah, thank you, convener. Does the panel have a view on how the definition and the bill as a whole could be future-proof to include emerging technologies, for example, sea source heat pumps, shared group loops, as we discussed there, whether the possibility of amendment by regulation is adequate to ensure flexibility as we may need over the next number of years.
Owen, I'll go with you on the lead again on this.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do so. And maybe if I take a step back, Richard, from the question, which is focused specifically on technologies, and point to, I suppose, heat networks. If you take very crudely and separate out into two different components, one is the sort of the generation side, which I think what you referred to, and the second bit is the heat networks. And one of the key things that we need to look at is ensuring that you're right, that those heat networks are absolutely future-proofed. And one of the ways to look at that is ultimately creating the heat networks to be technology agnostic, and also looking at how they can actually ensure that they're decarbonized or enable the easiest form of decarbonization. And so one way of doing that, I suppose, is looking at outcomes rather than sort of inputs. And so ensuring that a lot of the heat generated is I suppose, measured through carbon, and carbon contribution and carbon reductions is one way. Secondly, there's a technology aspect of this for heat networks. There's a large push for heat networks to decrease in their operational temperatures. For the wider group's benefit, a lot of old heat networks used to be run at very high temperatures, and that's a facet of the fact that they're ultimately running off old combined heat and power plants, which would be burning coal or gas. And so actually the temperature is a little bit irrelevant. But as we move towards low carbon and the next generation of technologies, what we can see is that the operational temperatures of those networks needs to come down. And that, Richard, answers your question about how do you future-proof it. If you can ensure that you have a lower temperature network, which is technology agnostic, that then means that you can then look at various degrees of how can you get the cheapest form of heat generation to use that network. And that could be sea, ground loop, it could be river source. And the key driver in this instance, I suppose, is touching on what Claire Mack said earlier on, is that Scotland is very fortunate to be blessed with a huge natural resource of, for example, wind, and it's actually using that low carbon energy to actually decarbonize the rest of society through heating and transport. So you're using that green electricity when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining. And the heat network itself is a very rudimentary. My engineers give me a lot of grief when I say it's just plumbing, but actually it's a simple concept, and actually when it can actually store energy as cheaply as it can through hot water, it actually acts as a key enabler for that modern energy system. So coming back to your question, Richard, I'd be reluctant to go very specifically on technologies and take a very technology specific approach, but try and look at the problem as a whole, which is both the electricity, power, transport, and where heat networks can enable that energy transition.
Just a quick supplementary, if you don't mind. Does the panel believe that energy companies and housing developers work together or work separately? Because there's a lot we could do to develop heating through connecting up energy companies and housing developers. Just a quick reply, maybe a yes or a no.
No, at the moment, very crudely. But I think there's room for improvement.
Right. Maybe Nicola. Yeah, we'll bring Nicola in. She wants to say something. Yeah, Nicola.
Yes, just that we actually do work quite extensively with housing developers. Granted, it's mainly in London. See more of that coming through the rest of the country. And I think they are taking quite a proactive view on their heat sources with a view to the requirements around decarbonisation. And I think that absolutely that is something that we should be promoting and looking to bring forward, more, to develop those relationships and to nurture them so that we become closer in terms of helping them with the way they design their buildings, so that we can get the best possible heat technologies into them. I think if it's all right for me to go back to the first question, I think from our perspective, the beauty of heat networks is that they are technology agnostic. So as Ewan said, it's a good sort of low regrets option in terms of being able to swap out the generation technology as the existing generation technology comes to its end of life, and to give us, a better opportunity then to make sure that we're keeping pace with whatever future developments are. And we think that in terms of the bill, with the fact that it gives ministers the powers to amend the definitions under the regulations, that provides a very proportionate approach to the way that we can make sure that both the regulations and heat networks themselves keep pace with future emerging technologies. But yeah, so to go back to your supplementary question, our view is we're doing it already. We would like to do more of it, as well as working with local authorities to develop out, and therefore covering social housing as well as private developers.
For the avoidance of, can I just check that when you talk about technology agnostic, you're talking about the heat supply, are you, or the generation? That's right, just so that we understood that. Claire, did you want to add anything?
No, I think it's been covered very, very well, but I think just to say that Owen mentioned this about the requirement on carbon emissions, and I think that's something that we need to be really, really aware of and keep front of mind, because our heat networks at the moment will need to compete with fossil fuel gas to be economically viable, and there is a need to ensure that level playing field, and one way of doing that is through measuring carbon emissions.
Thank you. Right, are you content, Richard?
Thank you.
Thanks. Can I move to Willie Coffey then, please? Willie.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. I wonder, firstly, could I ask the panel, anybody in the panel, what they think the public perception of all of this is? I occasionally tell my constituents what I'm doing with my time in the Scottish Parliament, and telling them that we're looking at this subject, it doesn't really register with too many of them as something that they're familiar with or aware of. So what do we have to do to raise awareness? Like, this is on the way, and it's hopefully something that they might agree with has been beneficial to them in the future.
Oh, off you go, Claire, then.
That one, thank you. I think, Mr. Scott, you're absolutely correct in that decarbonisation of our energy networks has been really successful, but it's been done very much behind closed doors. We're now at a different point where heat and transport are going to impact on consumers, they're going to impact on households, and you're absolutely correct that there is a need to bring them along with us and on board with us. I think there has been a lot of recognition in recent times, certainly over the last year or so, of the impacts and the risks of climate change. And I guess that's the kind of the why. Why are we doing this? Why would we do this? Because I've already spoken about the need to drive consumer demand here, and it's very right that you ask that question. And I think one of the reasons that we really need to, and one of the explanations we very much need to get out there is about the fact that the future costs of climate change have not been calculated yet. And very much like COVID, they will affect everybody. They will affect everyone. And the impacts of climate change will fall in a very similar way to COVID, which is that they will fall disproportionately. They will fall disproportionately on lower income households and those in less secure work. As extreme weather events and our resilience challenges impact their ability to work and to travel, and the type of housing that they live in means that they will likely suffer more than other people in different areas of society. So I think that's a really strong driver that we need to be really clear there. The other aspect of this is that this is a fantastic infrastructure opportunity. It's a fantastic infrastructure project. We need to do it for climate reasons, but we also want to do it for economic reasons, which is that, heat networks have, as Owen was talking about, some of the pumps can be manufactured here in Scotland, so we've got an existing supply chain, but actually a huge bulk of the costs of a project and the revenue from a project go into civil engineering works, which is something that we've got a huge strength in here in Scotland. So when we're thinking about how to modernise our economy and how to get ourselves fit for the future, for a cleaner, healthier, more resilient economy, that's the story that we need to start telling to everybody in Scotland as to why this is necessary and why it's necessary now.
Good. Thanks very much for that, Claire. Is there anybody else want to comment on that, or can I just ask another question?
I think if you go ahead and ask the next question, Willie, and they can always add it on. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask a really exciting question about regulation. As you know, Ofgem is a UK agency, so the government can't really appoint Ofgem as the regulator in our bill. Does the panel get any views on that, and whether we should invite Ofgem to be the regulator, or we appoint someone else, or should Scottish ministers retain that stewardship of regulation in the whole sector? So any views welcome, please.
Okay, who wants to lead on that? Any volunteers? Right. Nicola, I'm going to pick on you then, and then I'll go to Claire.
Thanks very much, Mr. Coffey. I mean, we can see that Ofgem have the appropriate skills and expertise to do this. I think we wouldn't say that Ofgem aren't an appropriate regulator. Obviously, you know, they are very well versed in skills. I think that you might consider them to be the Rolls Royce of regulation in an emerging market. And perhaps the ability for the Scottish ministers to have a closer eye on how this is coming forward in Scotland might be something that would be more desirable in the short term.
Claire, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I would echo exactly what Nicola has just said. You know, Ofgem absolutely fit for purpose. You know, they would know what they were doing here. I think what we need to think more about is the wider outcomes that we might want here in Scotland, which might direct us to maybe a different solution, which is that these are going to be, you know, one of the strongest sets of public-private sector partnerships we've ever seen in Scotland. And for that reason, the role of local authorities is really, really important. And being able to have them front and centre and amongst the regulation as we set it and as we monitor it and as we make sure that it's delivering the outcomes that we want, might suggest a different model as well. So I think one of the key aspects of this is around consumer protection as well, which is something that's really important, and I think Owen mentioned this earlier. It's not a devolved power of the Scottish Government, and the UK Government are developing regulations in this regard which could apply to Scotland. But there's also that opportunity, I guess, for us to think about whether those regulations should be devolved here and could be part of a package that would help us to develop a full sort of heat network kind of deal that would give us a different set of outcomes along those sort of social outcomes, along with just those economic regulatory outcomes, which should be one and the same. But you are bringing together a slightly different set of partners, and it could be that you would look at a regulatory system that might be more attuned to that.
That's clear. Anything, Ewan?
From
yes.
my point of view,
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, I think that I'd echo both Nicola and Claire's views. I think that the big thing for me is that, and the risk with going towards Ofgem is that they take a sort of a model which is based on electricity and not necessarily have the district heating skills or experience to apply that regulation. So I think that if that were the case, I think certainly they would need to be upskilled in that area. And I think that the other consideration is that it's always the case of any form of regulated business is that you need to balance the level of regulation with also sort of strategic innovation to enable that and recognizing that the industry is going through a huge amount of innovation, and it's going to need to innovate more. And as I touched on earlier, how you integrate, for example, heat pumps, heat networks with electricity, time of use tariffs, getting better customer protection, all needs to be ensured that it doesn't get bogged down in the worlds of old and well-established electrical regulation. So in principle, I think it could work, but I think that the detail would need to be fleshed out. And I think that as Nicola and Claire said, potentially keeping it closer to home in the early instances might be more prudent.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Can I just interject there, if you don't mind, Willie, and just ask for clarification on something? Would there be any conflict of interest if the Scottish Government were the regulator when they're driving the, I suppose, regulations themselves on what needs doing? Do the customers and the organisations need a third party who stands separate from government on this? I like Ofgem. Don't know who wants to answer that. Claire or Nicola? You, Owen, all of you? Okay, Nicola, off you go.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the benefits of having a third party organisation. I think the thing that possibly might need to be also considered in that particular field is the setup costs for a new regulator and the ongoing costs of running. I think the thing that we probably haven't made entirely clear at the moment is just how small the heat network industry actually is at this point in time. There are probably only a handful of players that operate nationwide, with other organisations being much more localised. And I think the cost burden of setting up regulation needs to be kept. And I have to say, we were very pleased to see that the Scottish Government has acknowledged that in the early stages those costs would need to be possibly absorbed in other ways. So I don't know if it would need Ofgem. I don't know if it would need an independent regulator. What it might need is actually a route for appeal or an independent ombudsman.
Thank you. Claire, did you want to add to that?
No, actually, Nicola's covered that absolutely perfectly. I'll step back. Thank you.
I'll go back to Willie then. Sorry, Willie, for cutting across there.
Thanks, Convener. Just happy to move on to other colleagues and allow them in.
Okay, in that case, can I go to Andy Whiteman, please? Andy.
Thanks very much. That conversation was quite interesting. I mean, we're actually not talking about a regulator here, we're actually talking about a licensing authority. And it's on that question I want to ask Vattenfall a specific question, because Section 11 of the bill deals with the revocation of heat network licenses. And it does so without any regulation making powers within it. So the revocations conditions would be as set in the bill, and it does so without any appeal rights. Now, I know, Owen, in your evidence that you've sought greater clarity under the circumstances under which a licence might be withdrawn. Can you say a little bit more about whether you think that should be on the face of the bill, or whether that should be in licensing, whether you think there should be an appeal right? And from the point of view of industry, what are the kind of things that end up with companies losing their licenses?
Yeah, a very detailed question. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Have I?
Andy.
No, you're fine.
We're actually, sorry, that's great. I didn't see my white microphone. Thank you very much, Andy. Where to start? So, in very broad terms, yes, we do think that the license is a very good step, and we think that it is needed. We think that it's one of the reasons why maybe 8 years ago Vattenfall were a little bit reluctant to come to the wider UK market and also in Scotland, because of the lack of standards and the potential for the industry to be not quite the wild west. But when we see the upcoming licensing coming, it means that there's going to be companies there with a certain level of both economic and economic standards, technical standards, as well as consumer protection. I think that the process of revocation of the license, whether or not where it should be dealt with, potentially could be through secondary legislation. But I must admit, I'm not completely au fait with the ins and outs of how these bills will actually sort of the mechanics of which will go through Parliament. And the question on how you end up losing your licenses is an interesting one. As in, a lot of the time, where in the markets we operate and we run, they are regulated markets. So in essence, all the operators are the likes of NG, ourselves, E.ON, whom are ultimately do business according to regulation and to standards. So the only instances where I can see that licenses are lost would be through persistent and continuing negligence of customers, poor performance, and I think that the awarding of a license, I suppose, is incumbent on the Scottish Government to actually be careful as to whom they award those licenses to. That the company has a sufficient, I suppose, technical, commercial, and financial standing to be able to deliver on those heat networks and experience, which is for consideration when those licenses are awarded. I'm not sure if I answered your question fully, Andy, but I'm happy to take any supplementary questions.
Well, I mean, maybe you could come back in writing, but you want more clarity over the circumstances and criteria under which a license may be withdrawn. So my
Yes.
question really is, should that be on the face of the bill, set out, A, B, C, D, E, or should that be left to regulation, which makes it more flexible?
Potentially through sort of secondary legislation, I think probably is where it could be. I think that I don't have an exact answer for you on that one, Andy. I think that the where it sits in the bill, I don't know. But I think having that clarity on what under what instances revocation would occur would certainly be welcome.
Yeah, that's clear. Thanks very much. I want to move on to part 2 of the bill, which is about the consenting process. At the moment, the bill stipulates that ministers will provide consents for these. Now, this is unusual because, in a sense, consent is in effect a planning consent, which is usually undertaken by planning authorities. So I'd be interested in the panel's view on whether it's appropriate for ministers to be awarding these consents, or whether this should be something that's done by planning authorities, or indeed whether planning authorities should perhaps deal with smaller schemes and ministers deal with larger schemes, which is the case, for example, with electricity, renewable electricity.
Right, who wants to pick that up?
Maybe Claire can start on that.
Yep. I think what you've suggested seems an incredibly sensible way to do this. I think, like you say, it is unusual in that consenting process for us to have a different approach in terms of how we would do planning. I think one of the things we need to recognise here is that this is a new technology, and it is something that needs strong power and drive behind it, because it's a full sort of wholesale technological change. So I wonder whether it's appropriate in those earlier circumstances and for those bigger projects to ensure that we can drive the strong messages to industry, that this is linked into the wider remit of the Scottish Government, which is that climate change is going to be a really strong driver for these networks to get out there in the early days, as we start to build demand and we start to build aggregation and we start to build those localised energy networks that Owen was talking about earlier. So I wonder whether that is appropriate for now. But regardless of that, as I said earlier, the strength of the public-private sector partnership is going to be really, really important here, and local authorities are central to all of that. So I can't see that they wouldn't be part of that development process, if not necessarily in that consenting stage.
Nicola, do you want to add to that?
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, I think that the important bit is the recognition of what's an appropriate, a fit and proper person in terms of the licensing, and then what's an appropriate scheme in terms of the consenting. I think the bit that probably we feel could be strengthened is around the transition and the consenting for existing schemes. That bit is probably the bit that's still slightly unclear to us, and the fact that there's no right of appeal, the potential is that investments could be made on schemes that then don't receive consent, and that leaves them inoperable and leaves customers stranded without heat, cooling and power. So that for us is probably the bit that needs to be clarified, and I think in our view that's something that probably should be on the face of the bill.
Owen, did you want to add anything to that? Owen?
Just to supplement Nicola and Claire's discussion on it is unusual, but actually for what we see as being strategically important national infrastructure, I think that some of the larger developments should be with, for example, the Scottish Government. And the concern would be obviously in relation to local area expertise in local authorities on district heating would vary widely, and so it's similar to one like I suppose in relation to Ofgem. If it does get devolved down to local authorities, there's a burden or an expectation that the people making decisions will have experience of district heating.
Andy?
Yes, I'll wind it up there. I mean, the local authorities having the experience of district heating, they act as planning authority for a range of developments of which they have no direct experience. I suppose my question is more focused on the fact that a district heating system has got much more impacts on local people, local businesses, residents, space, how it's designed and all the rest of it, than offshore renewables, which affects nobody in the vicinity. So whilst ministers are, consent to that, I've just got a question as to whether planning authorities should be completely eliminated from any consideration of these quite detailed and complex schemes that will affect a lot of people in a local area. Anyway, those answers were useful. Thank you, panel.
Yeah, just sort of picking up on some of that detail. I mean, obviously, if the bill doesn't specify sort of the framework and the time scale for on a heat work license, and the planning committee doesn't get to say, technical standards, if they're not referred to or detailed in the bill, there is going to be quite an open, shall we say, an open season in terms of, say, Scottish Government consenting to something being built. And as Andy refers to, its impact on the community in which it's being built. So would there be some degree of safety, if you like, if there was more specification on the face of the bill around the frameworks and timescales for actually building a heat network or a network and the technical standards to which it was built? Or do you think that would restrict, I suppose, development of heat networks as time goes by? I don't know if I can throw that one to Owen as a starting point.
In short, I think a lot of what we raised there could potentially be addressed through secondary legislation. I think that I don't have any strong views on that specifically. So maybe I don't know if maybe Nicola or Claire have a various different view on that. I'm happy to hand over to them.
Okay. Claire or Nicola, either one?
Yep, I'm happy.
Yep.
Convener. Yeah, I tend to agree with Owen is that given the need, this is an evolving situation and developing models. We are sitting developing new business models and new sort of local economic models to make these work. I think my sense is the same as his, is that secondary legislation would be quite valuable at this point, to enable that flexibility. I think as Mr. Whiteman actually identified as well, that is the benefit of using secondary legislation rather than putting things on the face of the bill. I think there is one area where we could perhaps strengthen, and that is around sort of zonal permits, which would potentially require local authorities to state whether they intend to issue zone permits, to offer some level of certainty, like say, to that timeline, because there is the situation where perhaps the enabling legislation is there, and the capability to create a heat network and get people to connect is there, but if you can't get the localised zonal permits in place, then it increases the risk. I guess it increases the risk to anybody coming in there. So that's one of the areas where we think there's potential to help strengthen it, is that particular area, is requiring local authorities to clearly state whether they intend to issue zonal permits, and if not, explain kind of why, and to publish alongside the zone assessment plan for commercialising the opportunities in there, what their other plan is for taking things forward.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Okay, can I move on now to Colin Beattie, please? Colin.
Thank you, Convener. This might be a question for Claire, actually. How long on average do you think it might take to recover the capital costs from a heat network, and therefore before a transfer competition can take place?
So actually, I think in terms of detailed timeline, my colleagues would probably be more well placed to answer that, having that they've had experience of this obviously abroad, and have rolled out within Europe. I think it's very clear that the trajectory that we're going to have to take, and I think that's what you've obviously identified, is that we start off with a set of kind of capital funding, which is perhaps subsidised in order to move this forward, like say that public-private sector partnership. There's lots of opportunities though, and I think that's where I sort of refer to the inclusive growth opportunities in here for different entities to become involved as electricity services companies, to become part of that process, and to use that role as a revenue generation proposition, and that includes people such as local authorities with the right skills and with growing the right expertise in there. I think there are huge opportunities in there. These are long-term capital projects, they're long-term capital revenue projects, but they will be around for a long time. These are future-proof solutions. And that's what's great about them, and one of the reasons why I think the operators and the industry feel so strongly about being technology agnostic is that it does retain that flexibility within heat networks in order to make sure that they are something that retains a value as an asset as it goes forward, and it doesn't become tied to some kind of fossil lock-in or some additional risk that we might start to see in the future because other legislation would come forward. We just are unclear at the moment how we are going to tackle climate change as a whole. More globally, things like carbon emissions taxation and other programs like that could very much alter the business models of some of these if we don't set them up in the right way just now.
So you're saying we don't know?
I'm saying that my colleagues, who've got experience of developing these networks, would probably be able to give you a more detailed answer.
Why don't we go to Owen? Owen, Vattenfall have experience of setting up heat networks, so
yeah. Hi, Colin. So how long to recover capital costs? This is long, double-digit years. So you're not getting single-year payback. So what you're investing in is a long-term asset, and the flip side of those long-term investment time horizons to return your capital is that you end up investing over 40 years. And as Claire mentioned, some of the assets that are put in place are around for a long, long time. Some of our heat networks in Berlin, for example, are around for 80 years and have been through the rise of the 2 world wars and the rise and fall of a Berlin Wall. So these are long-term assets they have a long-term payback as well. But where and why Vattenfall are happy to invest in those assets at lower returns is if we can manage risk. And that's one of the key things that we can see that this heat networks bill is trying to address, is that regulation, standards and quality which manages the risk, which allows Vattenfall to invest in an infrastructure asset over a long period of time. And so hopefully one of our projects, for example, out in Midlothian, looking at the Miller Hill district heating network, will be in place for a long time and actually will grow over 30, 40 years to enable economic development, because this is really what heat networks do, is they're an enabling technology that enables businesses, buildings to be built with low carbon at the heart of that. And yeah, it's so yeah. In short, capital recovery is a long time, and the flip side of that long time is if you could take 18 years roughly, isn't for example, payback, simple payback, and that's the reason why you can take those long-term investments, is that if you can manage risk over that period of time.
Nicola, do you have?
Yeah, so most of our contracts for our development of heat network are between 20 and 40 years, and that's because it takes, as Owen said, it can be up to 20 years just to pay back the capital that's been invested, and there's ongoing investment in the infrastructure as well. Our view of this is that actually you start small, so you'll start with a core number of buildings and look to build out, and as you build out, that tends to help bring the length of time that repayment takes down, and therefore you can speed up the recovery of your capital investment. But they are long-term investments with significant ongoing capex investment points in order to maintain them properly and to keep them operating effectively. It's quite an expensive business, I think, is what we're saying.
Colin.
Let me just flip this slightly different question. We talked earlier when Andy Whiteman was speaking about local authorities and so on. Should local authorities actually be under a statutory duty to carry out the assessment and designation of heat network zones? And what value is there in having ministers do it on their behalf? Happy for anybody to come in on that.
Okay. Claire?
In terms of the ministers do it on their behalf, I think it comes back to the point that Owen made earlier, is that this is, these are very large, critical national infrastructure type projects. And I think the benefit there is about weighting of resourcing. You know, we're very aware that heat networks at scale are not something perhaps that local authorities have had to tackle in the past. It's not to say that those skills won't ultimately grow and be delivered there, but in order to keep to maintain pace with the sort of level of projects that we're looking at, I think that's probably why you would set the resource at that ministerial level.
Okay. Are timescales in Section 38 adequate? In other words, to carry out a heat network zone review as soon as practicable and at least every 5 years? Again,
Nicola, you? Owen, sorry. Who wants to answer? I'll go with Nicola first then, and then I'll come to Owen. Nicola.
I think that every 5 years is a good start. I don't think that it would require to be any more frequent than that in terms of after the first one has been concluded, because even in current circumstances, it can take 1 year to 2 years to sort of agree and sign on new connections. So I don't think it's likely that there'd be significant change in that period of time. So I would say that that's a satisfactory timescale.
Okay, Owen, do you want to add anything to that?
That's fine. I agree with Nicola on that one. I think that the 5 year time frame is things aren't moving at rocket pace for these things. It's as I say, it's not quite glacial, but it moves at a very it's a slow rhythm. And I think that 5 years is sufficient. I think so that's fine.
Okay, Colin, are you happy?
yes, thank you.
Okay, can I move to Alex Rowley then, please? Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Can I pick up on this local authorities again and the role? Because Part 5 places the duty on public sector building owners to assess the viability of connecting the building to a network zone and then reporting to the local authority. So I suppose my first question would be why the duty does not apply to all domestic buildings? Why only public sector buildings? And would there be more potential there if we were looking at all buildings within an area, so all non-domestic properties? Why just public buildings?
Who'd like to go with that one? Right, Nicola and then Claire then.
I think sorry, I was just checking my mic was on. I think that the public sector buildings are a good start, and they often provide excellent anchor loads to build your district energy network around. They're generally speaking, and I think we always envisaged that the heat network zones would be developed with a degree of partnership with local authorities. I think that was how the working group saw this rolling through, and therefore it made a lot of sense that public sector buildings would have a duty to assess their ability to be a catalyst for a heat network, to be that that core anchor load. I think it makes a lot of sense to widen that out to other commercial buildings, but I think there is perhaps a view that could take longer and possibly wouldn't give us the catalyst that was required to move forward more quickly with these initial schemes.
And Claire?
Yep, so just to build a little bit there on what Nicola's saying, it's one of the things that we've identified is that there is a need to sort of improve the quality and use of information gathered from non-domestic buildings and aligning that reporting requirement with the heat network zone assessment process so that you can try and develop them in tandem, because whilst the public sector provide an excellent opportunity for that anchor load because they have very long-term views, that they are able, they sit in the same kind of timelines as some of these larger heat network projects. Also helpful to do that demand aggregation piece and moving to a place where we get better quality information around that non-domestic market and the viability of that is really important.
Thank you. Alex?
So I mean, local authorities, I'm in Fife just now, and I don't know if anybody's come across the district heating system that's run through the Wellwood refuse dump, where they're taking the gases there and they pump it into Carnegie Leisure Centre, high-rise flats, and a whole range of stuff there. But that then, I mean, that's a really good example of a successful local authority district heating scheme. But it then raises the question, I know that Scottish Renewables in their evidence, they state that it's important to recognise that local authority capacity to develop and operate heat network is constrained at present, and it will be vitally important that they are given additional resources and support from the Scottish Government to deliver the activities required of them. And that raises, probably for most people, alarm bells, because increasingly we see legislation passed that puts new requirements on local authorities without the resources coming to actually support that. So, I mean, are we confident in the current economic environment that we live in, and the fact that local authorities are cut to the bone and struggling to provide mainstream services, that they will have the resources and the capacity to be able to do this? I know that the panel this morning keep talking about the benefits of a public-private partnership. So what would the private bring to this? Or are we expecting the taxpayer to pay the money out and the private sector to take the reward, as so often happens within the renewable sector?
Right, big question. I'll go to Owen first, please, and then I'll come to Claire.
Hi, yes, that certainly is a big question. So I'm trying to sort of unpick that across several different areas. So one of the questions was around obviously looking at resourcing. So yes, we do think that local authorities' resourcing has been cut back to the bone, and what we're looking to try and do is in the deployment of those. If more obligations do cascade down to local authorities, that would need to be done in consideration with capabilities and resources. In relation to the deployment of heat networks and discussion around where benefits do or don't flow. So one of the good examples that we have is actually with Midlothian Council, where we're working to try and work with them in joint venture partnership to deliver a heat network across Midlothian from their Miller Hill energy from waste plant. And what we see is that the benefits are actually, well, twofold. One is that it's a joint venture equity investment. So actually as in we're investing and they're investing, so the same amount of money. What we also see is that our expertise from the continent is actually brings in risk reduction. So that one of the big things we bring is actually knowing how to do it. And actually so what we're actually doing is it's not a question of risk transfer at all. Ultimately, we're sharing risks, but actually what our role is actually to manage risks and reduce risks down. And what we'll end up doing is bringing that experience for the business development, the design, engineering, build, and manage those contracts to be able to deploy the network. And ultimately, the investment is done with us and with the local authority hand in hand. And I think it's something which we touched on previously, going back to Andy Whiteman's question, that heat networks are very different to an offshore wind farm. They are within the community. They are the lifeblood of a community, and actually, fundamentally, the pipes do go right into the heart and soul of people's homes, and so it's a very different concept. And we're very aware of that. And without actually that proper local engagement, and with both the people, local authorities, and all of the local stakeholders, it won't be successful. So. Yeah, in relation to that question of will, in essence, and profit just flow to private companies and risk remain with the public authorities, I don't think that's the case in any manner, shape, or form. And I think that the incorporation of those partnerships with local authorities reduces risk. It brings a level of capital investment, and actually also offers the benefit of local authorities to also invest with the same risk reward as the partnership, because it is a true partnership in that sense.
Claire, you were wanting to add something, I think.
Yeah, I think. Yep. Thanks, convener. Yeah, and I think that there is a very wide engagement from the renewable sector on socioeconomic benefits, including all sorts of things such as community benefit and local supply chain use. So I think that's needs to be pointed out. And I think if you look at heat networks, so the UK government have launched a 320 million capital fund for heat networks in England and Wales through their heat network investment programme, and that's seeking to leverage over £1 billion of investment back over the next 5 years from the private sector. So I think that's one of the areas where there is a return, which is that it's signalling that there is a good opportunity here and there's something there for the private sector to come in and work with and to bring their money to as well. I think, as Owen mentioned earlier, these are long-term investments, and so the revenue streams are not huge. You potentially, there are other infrastructure investments that you could make that probably would give you more return over a shorter period of time, but wouldn't deliver the same kind of certainty as you would get from this type of investment. And I think there's also, for the public sector, a set of wider outcomes that potentially come from that. And I mentioned this earlier, is that your heat network can be a springboard for other economic growth opportunities. If you decide that you're the kind of, if you want to draw the kind of industry in who are very heat intensive and how you might use that elsewhere. I think we've just talked there about heat transfer between different buildings. Again, is a very attractive kind of option. And I think as well, having that strength of the public sector within that kind of partnership allows them to bring the outcomes that they want to this too. And we're all very aware that clear outcomes are sought on things like fuel poverty, and we see that kind of potential for wider economic growth that springboards from something like a heat network.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah. I would only say to the sector that increasingly in Scotland, I do believe people are starting to question the renewable sector because the jobs are not coming that were promised. And unless the renewable sector wakes up to that idea, then the idea that you'll have the public on board with you when they see jobs going to every country but Scotland. The offshore wind farms in Fife is a perfect example of that. My final question, most local authorities, I assume, will have data on the energy performance certificates of their buildings. I would expect that most local authorities would have that now. But can I ask, is it likely that this process will rely on the existing data for the EPCs? If so, what would be the strengths of that and what would be the weaknesses of that? And that's my final question, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to lead on this one? Don't all volunteer at once. Right, Nicola, I'll go with you to start.
To be honest, I don't have any view on this. I think that the EPC data is useful and helpful, although sometimes not quite as complete as we would want it to be in order to make an assessment on heat demand. But it's a good starting place.
Okay. Anybody got anything to add? Claire, are you wanting to say anything? Yeah. Go ahead, Claire.
Just a sort of wider point around about EPCs is about heat networks in and of themselves are fantastic at doing what they do, but one thing that will go hand in hand with the rollout of heat networks is pretty serious and significant uptake of energy efficiency measures, and that's always the sort of first port of call in any kind of project of this size or shape, is that the best kilowatt hour is the unused kilowatt hour, and making sure that our buildings are as energy efficient as possible is really, really important. And I think having a certification system that reflects that as well and rewards that in any way that it can, I think is also very important.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to move to Gordon MacDonald. Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. I want to ask questions about Part 6 of the bill, the powers of licence holders. Owen, in your written evidence, you stated it's difficult to see how the envisaged powers will help in securing connection to anchor loads. What reasonable changes are required to the bill to help improve the viability of any new heat network scheme? Is it just an obligation to connect, as Claire mentioned earlier?
Very simply put, as in the obligation to connect is something which you do feel strongly would benefit for heat networks. And I think you need to make a separation between new build, which we think could be addressed through an obligation to connect through planning. So in essence, you'd have an obligation to connect or otherwise. So, and that otherwise would be based on if someone could actually find a heat network which, or say a heat source which is both cheaper and lower carbon. That's the standard, but the de facto assumption is they will be connecting to the heat network. And in relation to existing buildings, the obligation to connect, we do think needs to be strengthened, as in it's one of those things which I think we touched on anchor loads before, and how that de-risks investment, which again allows for longer term capital investment as well. So currently the obligation to connect is not as strong as we would like it to be. It isn't. There's a sort of an acceptance that public buildings will or should be on this. And the reason why we do see that obligation to connect is, again, it allows for a heat network to take a bigger view on the whole heat network, to be able to invest ahead of need in certain areas at different times. It also allows us to be able to sort of decarbonize. We touched on the public versus private sectors, and it's the commitment to public sectors and obligations on those to connect without having too strong a mandate for private sector to connect, which allows for the balance of new build versus retrofits to connect to the buildings. And what we see in Amsterdam is one of our networks, which we see is actually over 20 years when the projects started, 85% of the projects were new build, and that was through a planning obligation. 15% were retrofit. Today it's about 50-50, where planning obligation is still in place, but what we see is that the obligation to connect is tightening in relation to existing buildings. So as the boilers, for example, come to the end of their life cycle, they will then connect to the heat network, and that obligation is increasing through actual carbon tax as well. So actually people see this as being more of a beneficial way of connecting. So that obligation is not thou must connect, but it should be a case of, listen, how can we factor in the cost of still burning gas, level playing fields as well. So something which I think we should try and address in secondary legislation.
And what changes need to be made to wayleave rights in order that connections are made?
So the bill as it stands has very strong advocacy for wayleave access and rights. So we're happy with what's been put forward in the bill as it stands. So and that gives similar obligations and powers to a heat network operator as it would, for example, a water or an electrical utility. So I think that was a very positive step that we saw in the bill.
So just to move on, so my understanding is heat networks are long-term investments, 20 to 40 years. You made the suggestion that if there was an obligation to connect, it would de-risk investments. Are
Yes.
we in danger of creating localised monopolies? And what's in place that pricing will continue to be competitive in the long term and that a minimum level of service is provided to consumers?
I'm happy to take this question. I'm sure Nicola probably has a view on this as well. So yes, you are at risk of creating monopolies. What we would advocate is that there's always a level of regulation to manage that. So we're used to operating in for example, Amsterdam is another good example in relation to consumer protection on pricing. So in essence, there is a price cap put in place. So what we're looking to try and do is ensure that there is certainly an obligation to try and connect, but not necessarily an obligation on volume or pricing. And I think that the obligation on service and standards again would come through the consumer regulatory aspects to ensure a sufficient standard that protects the consumer in relation to pricing as well as service is absolutely needed as well. So and the obligation to connect, I suppose it is always a discussion on it should be an obligation to connect or otherwise. So in essence, if there is an otherwise viable solution that a consumer can put in, which is both lower carbon and cheaper, they should be able to go and try and do that. So it's a connection to connect, an obligation to connect or otherwise. I'm happy to give some space for Nicola to try and sort of come in on this. I'm sure she probably has a view on this too.
Nicola?
Yes, so I think that's part of the beauty of the licence, having to hold a licence to operate, and some of the backing behind the removal of a licence would be where you were either not competitive in terms of your heat price, or you were failing to deliver the standards of service that would be expected. And I think it's worth just remembering that right now there is no regulation. Heat networks aren't a regulated industry, and we do have heat networks all across the country, not just ourselves, there are other providers as well, with thousands of domestic customers connected to them, as well as commercial buildings. We've got standards of service that are in place that are contractual. Those are all covered off for commercial buildings, and we also register all of our heat networks where they've got domestic residencies connected to them with the Heat Trust. And that's a voluntary thing that we've chosen to do because we believe that, because it's the right thing to do, I guess, is how we feel about it. It is absolutely right that these will be natural monopolies because of the nature of how the investment is made and the way that the connections are made. But I think that's part of the reason why we welcome the bill as we do, because it should give confidence that appropriate standards are in place and that fit and proper people are operating these networks. So it in some way takes the sting out the tail of it being a monopoly.
And just my last question is in relation to provisions for compensation. I'm thinking about compulsory purchase powers, etc. So one local authority in evidence to the committee has raised concerns over the compulsory purchase powers and the impact on green space, biodiversity and forestry that may need to be removed as a result of new district heating networks. In addition, there is concerns regarding impacts on archaeological sites, scheduled monuments and listed buildings. Are there safeguards to force developers to remediate in these areas?
Are you directing that to somebody, Gordon, or?
Whoever's willing to answer.
Right, who's willing to answer? Okay, we'll go with Claire.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the beauties of the planning system that we already have here in Scotland, is that it's very robust, and all of the developers who sit within the Scottish Renewables membership are very aware of their requirement for a social licence to operate, as well as just a kind of a regulated licence to operate, if you will. And I think those kind of wider environmental considerations have always, whatever that be, whether it's sites of scientific interest or forestry or biodiversity, are always a consideration as part of a project, and very much part of the thinking when budgets are put together as to how you do reparation and how it is that you manage to work with the environment that you're working in. Not necessarily, we don't want to be part of the problem as an industry, and are very, very aware of our needs and responsibilities in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Nicola, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to point out that actually heat networks operate best in dense urban environments, so we generally are probably more of a pain to bus lanes and traffic than we are to green spaces. But Claire's covered it off perfectly. It's from a reputational perspective, these are the types of issues we would absolutely want to avoid.
Okay, thank you. Gordon, is that you complete?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. So can I move to Dean Lockhart, please? Dean.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to ask the panel about what projections are available for the heat networks in Scotland in terms of meeting heat demand going forward. There are some estimates that heat networks may reach 6 to 7% by 2025. But if you look at the longer term, what could that percentage look like over, say, a 30-year period by 2050? Are there projections available for this outlook?
Claire?
I don't have projections right out to 2050 in terms of percentages or whatever, but I think what we need to bear in mind is that our entire our commitment here in Scotland is obviously to net zero by 2045, and heat is a huge part of that. There are different treatments that we're going to have to apply to different areas in Scotland, as Nicola just talked about there. The heat networks work best in dense urban areas. It's something that we're kind of used to around other sort of network rollouts that we've done, where density of population has been a key variable in whether things have moved faster or slower. So I'm thinking about mobile networks here probably. And there will be different treatments and different solutions in different areas. So heat networks won't be the entirety of everything that we will do. There'll be other low carbon heat solutions that we will look to. I think so 55% of Scotland's energy demand is in the heat sort of space, and we have got an existing 113 heat networks which supply the equivalent of 1% of Scotland's total heat demand. And the reason why there's so many and that kind of quantum looks kind of unusual is that these are relatively small, because they've been built around the constraints, which is exactly what this bill is trying to unlock. And that's what's so good about this bill, is that it will unlock those constraints and it will allow us to get that better kind of bang for buck. So we did some research at Scottish Renewables, and we've identified 46 potential heat networks, which across all of Scotland, across all of Scotland's cities and towns. And I think that's another great aspect to heat networks, is they're very targetable. They're very targetable to places where you might want to see that development happening. And I think that's what's interesting about heat as a whole, is that you can apply an industrial strategy alongside this with that capability, because we do have manufacturing here, and because the bulk of the work is civil engineering work, which means it has quite a different supply chain profile perhaps to other renewables as well, which is one of the reasons why it actually has such a strong potential from that green economic recovery perspective. But our research has suggested that those 46 heat networks that we've already identified could provide 8% of Scotland's heat by 2030. So that's a very quick and rapid expansion, and also a very rapid decrease in carbon emissions as well, and just to that 2030 mark. But in 2030 and beyond, I'm not sure, perhaps Nicola and Owen might have some projections from their own companies that might be valuable here.
I'm unmuted. So thank you for the question. So in very quick, short response, how far we get ultimately actually depends a little bit on the stimulus that that bill can provide to give that framework and confidence for investment in these heat networks. And where we're going to see it going is, crudely, the heat networks are the cheapest and the best value way to deliver low carbon heat in densely and urban areas, and that could provide, we think, up to maybe 20% of low carbon heat, very crudely, by late 2040s. But as I say, it's something which doesn't happen overnight, and it's something which does build up slowly. But you need to start making that investment, that decision now, and grow from there.
Dean?
Thanks, convener, and thanks to the panel for those very helpful answers. I understand projections are always subject to some variability, but I think the targeted nature of the projects means that hopefully those projections have some degree of accuracy. I'd like to follow up, convener, and I'm conscious of time, briefly on the just transmission impact of the development of heat networks. Are there estimates of how many jobs could be created, how many jobs might be lost in traditional heating areas, and what other impacts on the wider economy might we see from this just transition?
Okay, Claire, do you want to lead on that one?
Yep, the energy transition needs to be a just transition. That is absolutely clear, and people need to be at the heart of that energy transition, and it's something that's never been more at the forefront of our minds in renewables as it is right now, because of the difficulties that the oil and gas sector are feeling just now, and the potential for us to create further pipelines in that offshore space. In renewable heat will still require maintenance. There's still that opportunity for people who work in heating now to be able to bring up to get a dual set of skills, to be working on the electrical and the gas side whilst we do that transition, and then transition fully to the electrical side as we move into that kind of more majority of low carbon space. I think one of the things we would certainly advocate for as a trade association is manage that transition. I think we've seen energy transitions that haven't been managed in the past, and we know the catastrophic effects of that. So I think we've got that opportunity to do that now, and perhaps thinking about a renewable transition training fund to help the people who are currently working in heating to be able to pick up the dual set of skills that I talked about there. I think lessons from continental Europe tell us that ahead of us decarbonising heat, we need to switch our homes away from gas. We'll also need advanced insulation as well, and it's that energy efficiency programme that I was talking about, which does have a lot of near-term jobs in it. It's something that can be kicked off actually relatively quickly and can bring jobs forward in that sort of nearer-term space. And there is that opportunity, like I say, to transition our tradespeople and to become kind of all-round energy advisors, to widen that role, to make it a much, to add additional higher skill opportunity in there, working with homeowners to help them optimise energy systems and to help them reduce bills, and to be able to manage, micromanage their own energy use, as simply of using solar perhaps to charge electric vehicles, and then using electric vehicles to help power heat networks. Is something that's a really exciting prospect for the future, and something that will need supported.
Okay, and Nicola, I think you were indicating that you wanted to come in on that one.
Yes, so there were proposals put from the Heat Networks Industry Council to the UK government just in the last few weeks that suggest that there could be 20 to 35,000 new direct jobs in the sector by 2050. I don't have the breakdown of how that would play through into Scotland. Presumably, though, it would be proportional based on the number of heat networks that we're able to develop here. And given that we're ahead of the curve in terms of the regulation and the stimulus for heat networks, you would hope to see that more of those jobs would appear here in the shorter term.
Thank you, Nicola. Is that you complete, Dean?
Yep, that's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go very quickly to Andy Whiteman, who's got a short extra question. So, Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's just on the question of permits. I mean, I've got to make sure that this bill, or recommend to Parliament whether we agree with the general principles of this bill, and it's still not clear to me how the permitting system will operate. For example, as I read it, there's no explicit requirement for a permit holder to have a licence, or indeed for consent to be in place, and yet those are grounds for a permit to be revoked. Can a permit be awarded, for example, to a person other than a licence holder who has sought consent over an area? What would happen there? Now, you're people with experience in implementing here. Does this model of a licence holder, a consenting process, and then a permits operating in zones, is that novel, or does that replicate how it operates elsewhere? And if it does, presumably there are no problems, but I'm still a little bit unclear about how permit systems will operate. Can any of you help me?
Okay. Who's an expert in how permanent systems operate? Don't all volunteer at once. Right, I'm going to go to Owen then and work way around all of you. So
lovely. So in short, Andy, I'm no expert in permits, and I'm happy to submit supplementary evidence if you wish on how it's done across various different countries. So Sweden, Germany, or Netherlands, for example. But I do think that some of the points you raised there around there seems to be a slight disjoint on that clarity on permitting versus sort of licensee awards. So in short, I think that's something we maybe need to sort of form a better view on, just in case, so I understand what the issue is a bit more on that.
Okay, so we can maybe come back to us, or we write to you about that. Claire, do you have any clear views on permits?
I think it's one of the areas that we think there is scope for clarification and strengthening, is that licences and permits do need to work in tandem, because having the infrastructure in place and the licence to operate it, but without the kind of permitting part, does mean that you introduce something, a potential barrier, and the reasons for that, and then the situations and the circumstances around that need to be clear. So I think that was something that I think we felt was that if local authorities are issuing those permits, that if they decided not to issue those permits, it would mean that the network didn't go ahead. And there would need to be a very clear set of circumstances stated as to why that would be the case, because you would be quite far down the road at that point. So I do think there's potential for clarification and strengthening of that aspect of the bill.
Just to be clear, it's Scottish ministers who award permits. Yeah, just to be clear, it's Scottish ministers who award permits, not local authorities. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is clearly an area which we need to get our heads around and make sure we understand, so that whatever ends up on the bill, if it gets approved at stage 1, makes it quite clear and it doesn't fall through a big black hole or a gap and create problems down the line. Nicola, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think our understanding from the discussions was that these things should be aligned, but I recognise that possibly how it reads in the bill doesn't convey the intent.
Right.
So, and I guess the point being that it's not something that's in existence anywhere else in the UK. So there's always challenges when you're forging a path, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe that we need to revisit the wording and make sure the intent is clear, and that there isn't a lack of transparency in the way it's presented. Andy, are you content with that for now?
Yeah, and I think it's an area we need to explore further. Thank you, Convener.
Absolutely. Right. Well, thank you, everybody. I've got no other bids for questions, but I am aware that it's quite time constrained this morning, and that we may well have other questions in the light of some of the conversation we've already had. But in the meantime, can I thank Claire and Owen for their time today? I think that's been a useful start in terms of our inquiry on heat networks. So I'm going to close out this panel now with that thank you and potential to get back in touch with you. And we will take a short 5-minute break. So we'll reconvene just before 11:10, please. But I'll see you all in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener.
Right, and welcome back. And we will now continue to take evidence on the Heat Network Scotland Bill. And I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, Michael King, Director of Heat and Power. Unfortunately, we haven't got Colin Reid with us due to illness. So, Michael, I'm afraid this morning you're on your own as a panel of one, but plenty of opportunity to tell us what you're thinking around some of this Heat Networks proposition. So I'm going to begin with the first question from Alison Harris. Alison.
Good morning. I would like to ask you about the projections that there are for the heat networks in Scotland over the next 30 years and what contribution they could make to achieving the net zero GHG emission and tackling fuel poverty.
Well, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your question. Earlier in the year, in March, I believe that the Scottish Government published a memorandum on the bill, and in that it suggested that in the absence of legislation, is that heat networks could grow to about 4% of delivered heat by 2050. With a minimal intervention, it would grow to about 8%, but with a stronger intervention, particularly in using waste heat and renewables, it could reach 12%. Now, in respect of Aberdeen Heat and Power ourselves, is that we have a forward pipeline, fairly secure forward pipeline of about 1,000 connections over the next 3 years, and that will actually grow our network by approximately 30%. But I would emphasise that those are confirmed or secure pipeline, and the likelihood is that it will snowball.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of financial investment, are there any investments, any estimates of what can be achieved?
Could you clarify the question? What do you mean by investments?
Well, just any financial investment. I'm really looking to see if there's any investments as to, if we're looking over the next 30 years, is there any figures in relation to this?
I do believe there are. I don't necessarily have them, but the opportunity is there, and there is a great deal of interest from investors in this sector. The problem has been how to actually address the risk, and indeed, this is one of the purposes of this particular bill.
Yes, because obviously, when I was thinking about the transition, the just transition impact of the development of the various heat networks, any thoughts on how many jobs could be created? How many are likely to be lost from traditional heating professionals? Have you any thoughts on that or comments?
I believe that Nicola Mahood made a comment earlier about an estimate of from the Heat Networks Industry Council, which, if I recall, was in the region of about 73,000 jobs. I must say is that it does also once again have a snowball effect. Is that in Aberdeen is that we have created 5 jobs directly ourselves, but then there is a supply chain leading into that of local plumbers who are actually installing systems within people's homes, and so it does actually kind of create more outside of the industry directly.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate your response.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Can I move to Richard Lyle, please? Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Michael. I think you're a shining example of what can be done, and I've always believed that we could do more in regard to heat networks, and we could have developers and house builders promote this. We all know that a heat network is either a district heat network or a communal heating system. Can I speak to you in regard to definitions? Can you tell the committee how you believe the definitions and the bill as a whole could be future-proof to include emerging technologies over the next number of years?
Thank you very much for your question, Richard. I believe that witnesses this morning, Owen Morgan, I believe, referred to the fact that heat networks are an infrastructure that actually are agnostic to the heat source, and so consequently is that they facilitate the development of new technologies. For example, is that one sort of proposition in terms of decarbonising heat has been the development of hydrogen. However, the Committee on Climate Change suggests that hydrogen will not be widely available until 2035, which only leaves us 10 years to hit the target set by the Scottish Government. However, is that if we expand the use of heat networks, it will be much easier to retrofit hydrogen plant into those centralised plant rooms on heat networks than to go around and visit each individual building. So consequently, it will actually facilitate the advance of this new technology.
Yeah, so we really need to ensure that we have flexibility. So do you think whether the possibility of amendment by regulation is adequate to ensure flexibility?
To be quite honest, is that I think that the definition as it stands at the moment is adequate. I think other witnesses referred to the issue of a temperature, and I think that there is a general move throughout the heat network industry, both in Europe and North America, to lower temperature systems, and this will actually help in respect of connecting technologies such as heat pumps into the system. And I think that is going to happen anyway. And I'm not quite sure whether it is necessary to actually define that in the bill.
Can I thank you very much for your comments to my questions this morning. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I move to Willie Coffey, please? Willie.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Michael. Could I just ask you for your views on regulation? We heard Nicola in the previous panel saying that heat networks are not a regulated industry. Can you give your views on that and whether and who the regulator might be? Ofgem, as you know, is a UK body, so if you agree that there should be regulation, who should provide it?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question, Willie. I think elsewhere it was commented that heat networks are a natural local monopoly, and if you have a monopoly, is that you need to have regulation to balance that out. Now, at the moment, it is an unregulated industry, and this can lead to instances of abuse. The industry is trying to address that through the creation of the Heat Trust, but that only goes so far in that it is voluntary. Now, elsewhere, as we know, is that BEIS are proposing that Ofgem should become the regulator, but I think that there's a number of tensions between that and what is proposed in the bill. Firstly, is that consumer protection is a reserved matter, and so that needs to be addressed in terms of engagement between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government. But also is that they're taking a slightly different approach. And so consequently, actually having the Scottish Government as the regulator is most probably prudent. But nevertheless, as things advance, it will be necessary, I think, to liaise closely between the two governments. I think that the last point is that the pace at which these things are running. Although the BEIS have actually indicated that Ofgem will be the regulator, I understand that that is not likely to happen for about another 3 or 4 years due to the pace of change. Whereas what is being proposed under the Heat Networks Bill is going to be much more rapid. And so consequently, in the absence of regulation from Ofgem, I think it is appropriate for the Scottish Government to take on that responsibility.
Okay, many thanks for that. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Can we move to Andy Whiteman, please?
Thanks very much indeed, Convener. Aberdeen Heat and Power obviously is operating a heat network just now. Are you clear that you will, if this bill passes into law, that you will have to therefore apply for a license and comply with this law, even though you're already in existence? Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, yes. Our concern over this is that in respect of requiring these or obtaining the required license permits, consents, etc., that there will be a regulatory burden upon us, is that we are a not-for-profit. We are aim to be a very lean machine, and consequently is that we do not have large reserves, is that our objective is the alleviation of fuel poverty. So consequently, any additional cost in terms of these requirements will be passed through to end users, and we would be concerned to avoid that as much as possible.
So you mentioned that specifically related to yourselves as a existing provider, and I think there are issues there about how existing providers can, as it were, fast track into a position of being licence holders and all the rest of it, given the scheme, they've already got the consents. But do your concerns there in relationship to being a not-for-profit and being focused on fuel poverty, do you think that poses questions about this bill and the kind of players that may or may not be able to come into the market and be focused like you are on social ends?
I think it's a very good question. I think in terms of the cost burden that I referred to earlier, I mean, I have kind of raised concerns about this elsewhere, about how this may impact not on existing networks, but on new networks that are, say, community-based in serving small villages in rural areas. You know, that is a concern.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I note that the bill does contain provisions that regulations may be made around this, which could potentially exempt or partially exempt certain organisations from the full rigour of a licensing regime, but that is not spelt out in the bill. Can I just ask you a little bit more about the fuel poverty dimensions of this? I mean, the need for heat networks is being driven by a need to decarbonise heat, and also to provide more affordable and reliable heat sources for people. I mean, what role do you think that heat networks can provide in the alleviation of fuel poverty more generally across Scotland?
Well, thank you for picking up on that. I beg your pardon as that I didn't pick up on the second part of your previous question, which was about fuel poverty. And it is a concern to us that it does not appear on the face of the bill, is that it does mention decarbonisation, but not fuel poverty. And we think it would be helpful in terms of locking in future administrations into that it does appear. In respect of your second question about how this can help address fuel poverty, in the main, the focus has been against a benchmark of current fuels such as fossil gas or electricity. But studies by consultancies such as Element Energy and Fortec looking forward find out that most pathways to a decarbonisation of heat will result in an increase in the cost of heat for the end consumer. The one exception to that is where you have heat networks, particularly ones that are associated with waste heat, energy from waste plants and such like, where you will actually see it equivalent to business as usual, if not negative. So out of all of the technologies going forward, it is most probably the best to address fuel poverty.
Okay, thank you. And your scheme has been in existence for how many years?
We were established in 2002 by Aberdeen City Council, specifically to address fuel poverty in their high-rise blocks, of which they have 59, and we are now over 50 of those treated. Starting from nothing is that we now have 15 kilometres of pipe networks. We have approximately 7 megawatts of CHP capacity, 30 megawatts of thermal capacity, 5 plant rooms, 5 employees, turnover of 4.4 million. So, you know, we hope we're making progress.
Good. So you're a wholly owned company. You're wholly owned by Aberdeen City Council. Is that correct?
No, we're not. Is that we are a company limited by guarantee, and as such, is that we have a membership structure. There are 5 members, of which Aberdeen City Council is one, so that they are a minority owner of the company.
Okay, thank you. And presumably you needed planning consent to do a lot of the works, the physical works you've done. Is that correct?
This is a question that came up in the previous session, and I think there's a distinction because for the networks, the heat networks are actually below ground, and so consequently is that that particular aspect does not require planning consent. However, the plant rooms, which are of course are above ground, do require planning consent. And I think that that they would need to address all the issues that you raised in your previous question in respect of environmental protection. And I understand that in that respect is that SEPA is actually a recognised consultee for this, and so hopefully that would address those issues. But just apart from that, is that I think that as a plant room is actually within the community, I think it's right that that should be addressed by the local planning authority to ensure that it beds in into the local community.
So just to be clear, part 2 of the bill is about heat network consents. And as it stands at the moment, it would be Scottish ministers who make decisions about heat network consents, which carry with them, as I understand it, a deemed planning consent. So it would be your view that certainly for some schemes, if not all, you can maybe clarify that these consents should be awarded by planning authorities rather than by ministers. Is that your view?
No, I think that you're misunderstanding me there with respect, is that the heat network is the bit that is below the ground, and that would be covered by the consent. Now, it may be that no plant rooms are required because the heat is being drawn from some other source. For example, in Aberdeen, is that the City Council, in association with the County Council and Moray, are currently constructing an energy from waste plant, which we anticipate that we'll take a connection from. Now, in that instance, is that we would not need to actually have planning permission to connect to that. That is a wholly different matter. It's only if the plant room was within our ownership would we have to pursue that. And in that instance, I do think that it most probably appropriate to go to the local planning authority.
Okay, thanks. That's very useful clarification. That's me, convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Can I move to Colin Beattie now, please? Colin.
Thank you, convener. Can I ask, on average, how long do you think it might take to recover the capital costs from a heat network, and so allow the transfer competition to take place?
It's a very good question, and I would not want to be seem sort of slightly trying to avoid it, but very often the payback will vary from project to project. There is no sort of standard in this respect. It's about the size of the load, the number of buildings that are connected, the capital required to install the plant room, to connect them together to the plant room, and how long the revenues from those loads will take to recover that capital. In the main, it is not a short-term payback. At the minimum, it will be about 7 to 8 years. At a maximum, it can be over 20 to 30.
Yes, the previous panel actually had a wide variation in timescale. They were talking from between 18 to 40 years, which, from a planning point of view, if you're investing capital, it creates a lot of uncertainty as to when you're going to get that capital back.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you, and that I think is one of the purposes of the bill, is to increase investor confidence, so that they have some certainty about recouping that investment.
Yes, it's a very patient investment, I think. What do you think of the strengths? Sorry?
I beg your pardon, sorry, continue.
No, I was going to actually develop another question, but if you've got something to add, please do.
Well, I think that in many places is that at the outset is that the principal investor has been the public sector, either directly as local governments or through grant programs at national level, and now the ECO, Energy Company Obligation. We have benefited from free capital, if you like, from those that enable us to move forward.
Realistically, are we going to find capital invested for 40 years from the private sector?
I think that most probably what will happen, and I think that this is the sort of the general way that things are happening in the UK, is that at first is that these things will be public sector led or public sector influenced at the very least, through the development and early construction and early operational phase. Once the project has been de-risked, then the public sector have the opportunity to refinance that. And at that point is that I think that there is appetite from institutional investors such as pension funds to come in, because it fits their risk profile. It gives them the sort of stable but low returns that they would typically find helpful in their portfolio.
You use the term de-risked. Can you define that?
So that is actually once all the costs and revenues have been stabilized. So once people understand what their kind of costs are likely to be, the revenues are coming in, they've got about 2 or 3 years of understanding what those might be, and at that point is that it could be refinanced.
Okay. What do you think the strengths and weaknesses of a transfer system as set out in the bill are, and how should a company be protected?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? Is that I didn't quite hear you.
What are the strengths and weaknesses of a transfer system as set out in the bill, and how should a company be protected?
I think this is one of the kind of the questions that we are concerned about, is that we can see that under the licensing regime, if a company or organisation is found to be no longer considered to be fit and proper, then it will need to be the assets will need to be transferred to another company in terms of providing security of supply to the end consumers, so supplier of last resort. In respect of that is that we don't quite clearly understand that, because these assets actually belong to us as a company. Is it proposed that these would simply be taken away from us, or would we be compensated for them? How is that going to work? We don't know.
But assuming that we've reached the end of the period at which there is a concern about the stability of the revenue and the capital cost, surely then whoever takes it over is effectively buying a source of revenue, which we have a
that is the basis of refinancing, yes. But there is no kind of suggestion that that will be paid for.
So the public sector would hand it across for free?
Well, that is what one would need to actually address.
I mean, I'm assuming the public sector is going to be getting a return, particularly as the period, the repayment period goes through. If you say, let's say it's 40 years, somewhere in that period, they will trigger a surplus, and that surplus would either be reinvested back into the company or come back to the public sector in some way.
Yes, Pardon me, I thought I'm actually we're talking on different issues. Is that I think that you are correct in that. Where I was going is that where a license is withdrawn, that is the issue where I think that there's more clarity needed.
Okay, well, we note the fact that you feel that. Really, I'm just trying to explore how the actual transition is going to take place at the point at which the private company moves in. I am assuming there will be a transfer of some value to the public sector.
It would depend if they were actually selling the asset in its entirety. It may be that they actually only sell a percentage of the equity, and that would be bought by a private investor, such as a pension fund, as I suggested.
Would there
so
be...
the math would remain the same, but the ownership structure would change.
Okay, so the actual management of the company would not change. There would simply be a background change of ownership.
Yes.
So the assumption is that I mean, we don't know yet whether the public sector would hire someone from the private sector in order to run the business for them.
That is a possibility. All sorts of options are open to them.
My concern, obviously, is to ensure that the public sector gets value for money in investing into these assets and then transferring them in whole or in part to the private sector.
The public sector, if it invested in it, could take the option to retain 100% ownership, in which case they would get the revenue. They could decide that they wish to exit from it, in part by selling a share of the equity, or they could actually exit entirely by selling 100% of the equity. There's been a great example in the city of Toronto, where the city council, in association with its pension fund, developed a heat network, taking heat out of the and cooling out of Lake Ontario. They developed it, the network downtown, and then sold the whole lot to Brookfield's management fund, and in the process is that the city council made a $300 million profit, and so there is an opportunity for the public sector to benefit from this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one of the things, Michael, that probably comes up there is the issue about whether licensing should be a person or whether it should be a legal entity. The bill seems to suggest that it's an individual, a sort of named individual, a fit and proper person, as we do with alcohol licensing. But I don't know whether you have a view on whether that should perhaps be extended or changed so that it should be the legal entity, i.e. a limited company or an organisation, than an individual, so that individuals can come and go, but it's the organisation that has the licence to operate.
Thank you for the question. I suppose that there is a similarity to the licensing of pubs, where if you go in a pub, is that it's the individual landlord whose name is across the top of the pub, but the entrance. But it's actually like the company that is providing the service, and I think our concern is that people change within companies, and is there going to be a cost in terms of reassigning this to a new individual coming in?
And with alcohol licensing, there is an exam in effect that goes with being the license fit and proper, because they've taken this mini exam that they have to do to tick the box to say they know what's required, etc. So I think there is a question mark around that, perhaps, that we need to explore.
Yes, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Okay, can we move to Alex Rowley, please? Alex.
Hi, Michael. When you spoke with Andy earlier, you talked about fuel poverty. I wonder what more should be done to ensure that fuel poverty is considered when designating heat network zones and issuing the permits. Do you think more should be done?
Well, as I understand it, Alex, is that this will be dealt with in secondary legislation, and in particular the issuing of licenses and consents, where people applying for them will actually have to demonstrate well, they're kind of fit and proper people, but in respect of a consent, coming forward with a proposal, a business plan that actually seeks to build out a heat network over the whole area, whilst actually hitting some form of price benefit for the end consumers. As that is not actually in this particular bill, is that we feel that it should actually have a hook in it, which actually references fuel poverty, so that it is more that it kind of hooks into the secondary legislation more seamlessly.
Okay, good. And there's an opportunity for amendments, so it's worth taking on board, Michael.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw the last session.
In our kind of response, is that we did suggest a particular position in the bill where that could be put in.
Great, thank you. I mentioned in the last session about the fact that there was a requirement on buildings, public-owned buildings. Just to get a feel for it, I wonder, I mean, I talked about the scheme in Fife that I know well, which links up to a community asset and in terms of the Carnegie Leisure Centre, it links up to high-rise flats. I wonder, could you give us a feel for your scheme and what kind of buildings? Have you got an anchor building? How does it work?
Yes. So our approach, well, firstly, to say that we actually have a framework agreement with the City Council that gives us exclusivity to build heat networks and a CHP plant within their buildings. Now, initially that was focused on the high-rise estates that I mentioned, but it also includes administrative offices, schools, etc. Now, the approach that we've taken is that most of these high-rise blocks tended to be in clusters, so that we could develop a heat network island, if you like, that was financially sustainable and viable, serving just that island. And so, in a way, is that those housing estates became our anchor loads, and we then used those to connect them together, picking up other buildings along the way. Now, initially, a lot of those were a public sector, but now is that because of the fact that new connections to the gas network are going to be banned from 2024 onwards, we are getting inquiries from private developers about how they could connect to our networks.
So there is, you believe, potential there for we shouldn't be restrictive in terms of just publicly owned buildings. That there is an opportunity, but I wonder, Section 38 says that each local authority must carry out a review to consider whether one or more of the areas has potential to be designated as a heat network. This must be done as soon as practicable after this section comes into force, or at least every 5 years. Do you think that's adequate?
Yes, I do. I think one of the difficulties of rolling this out in other towns and cities across Scotland is that there has been no statutory duty. Aberdeen Heat and Power provides an example for lots of other towns and cities, not many of which have followed. And in the main, it is because from a strategic point of view at the top of the local authority, it's not a statutory requirement. So why should they do it? So actually, like making it a statutory requirement encourages them to focus on this area, and hopefully they will understand the opportunities that it brings in terms of addressing climate change, addressing fuel poverty, addressing urban regeneration.
So just what you've said, and finally, Michael, from what you've said, I'm certainly reaching the view that the local authorities are absolutely key to this. If this is going to be delivered, then the local authorities must be totally on board and driving this. Do you agree with that? And then secondly, where does the expertise exist? Because some local authorities, it's not been for a lack of will that they've not done some stuff around renewables. I think it's been not having the expertise to be able to drive it forward. So where does the expertise sit, and is the local authorities key?
Well, I think that you're right. I think that commentators throughout the world have recognised that municipalities, local authorities are the key to the development of heat networks. They actually have the vision in terms of the whole of their area rather than just the edge of a development site. They are the planning authority, and so they have the ability to shape the town in terms of the mix of use, the size of anchor loads, this, that, and the next thing. So local authorities also own a great deal of buildings which actually can be put into the mix to provide an anchor load and underpin the thing financially and technically, but also is that they tend to be at the centre of a web of relationships with different people within their locality. Now, so I do think that they are key. The issue about competence and skill is a problem. People refer to this as being a kind of a new technology. It's not. It's a very, very mature technology, but in other parts of Europe, not in Scotland. And so consequently is that there is a lack of expertise, particularly in the local authority sector, for this. So I think that the way that this has been addressed in the bill, where if a local authority does not have the competence to be able to do it, then the Scottish Government can step forward and take over responsibility for that. The concern is that that we would want to make sure that the people within the Scottish Government had the requisite skills to be able to deliver these things on behalf of the local community.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I move to Gordon MacDonald now then, please?
Thanks, Convener. Just to continue the conversation about buildings that Alec Rowley's begun. As we're aware, Part 5 of the bill places a duty on public sector building owners to undertake an assessment of the viability of their buildings being connected to a heat network. Are energy performance certificates sufficient to adequately assess actual performance and suitability of a building to be connected?
Certainly. Thank you for your question, Gordon. The key things that you would need to understand is what is the demand for heat within that building, not only in absolute terms, but the shape of it. So what does it look like during the course of the day, during the course of the year? Now, most large buildings with EPCs will have derived the data that they need to generate the EPC from the typical way of providing heat at the moment, which is gas. And so by just simply kind of looking at their gas bill, that will provide them with the information that they would need to make an assessment in terms of connecting to a heat network.
And you mentioned earlier that no new gas connections from 2024, and you're beginning to get inquiries from privately owned commercial properties.
Yes.
You know, have any of them been connected already to your network? What's the sort of length of contract that they need to enter into? And what are the additional benefits that they would get with being part of Aberdeen Heat and Power?
Well, I would, addressing the last one first, is that because we've been in existence for 18 years, is that over that period of time is that we've developed the competences to be able to provide a good service, a reliable service, a secure service. So I think that that would be the attraction for them. At the moment is that we don't actually have any private developers connected to the system, but we are in conversation with them. One of the challenges will be who will be responsible for interacting with the end consumer. This is a very challenging area of activity. So I think that in the main is that we would prefer to be able to sell them bulk heat and for them to actually establish some sort of vehicle for the management of the heat network on their development.
And, you know, at the moment, this bill only places a duty on public sector buildings. Should it be on all private buildings that they have to carry out an assessment to encourage them to think about connecting?
I think that starting with the public sector is a good place to start, but I would anticipate that it would need to roll out to other major buildings as well.
And are there any public buildings that are out with the scope of this bill? I'm thinking about back in the 1980s and 90s, we had a lot of councils outsource their services to ALIOs, arm's length external organisations, to run, for instance, in Edinburgh Leisure runs all the sports facilities. Would they be included in the definition of public-owned buildings, do you know?
Well, I guess so, because it's the management that is being outsourced, not the ownership, and so they would still, I presume, qualify as public sector buildings. Because the public sector can take a long-term view, all the other reasons I mentioned before in terms of its aims and objectives. I think that the likelihood is that these spine mains or putative projects will develop on the back of a public sector load. It makes sense that that those would be extended to large commercial buildings, which you would use to the definition of large using the EPC, and that those would then connect in, and that would then bring into place a heat network in most of Scotland's towns and cities, to the point that when fossil gas was withdrawn, that other buildings which are much smaller would have the opportunity to connect to a heat network and get lower zero carbon heat from that at a reasonable price. Whereas if we don't actually build out the networks now, then those smaller buildings, including residential buildings, homes, would not have that opportunity. That's actually like building the platform now.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dean Locke.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask if, in practical terms, this bill is likely to encourage your organisation to invest more in heat networks, and if so, can you please explain why?
Right. Well, I think that there is a barrier remaining, and I think it has been referred to in the discussion this morning, and that is around the obligation to connect. The way leaves right, as outlined in the memorandum that was published by the Scottish Government in March, indicates that it would be possible to build a heat network up to an anchor load building, but you would not be able to oblige that building to connect. The argument is that that whilst that kind of extension was happening, that a contractual negotiation could take place between the heat network operator and the anchor load building owner, and the fact that the pipe network was coming up to that point would facilitate that discussion. Secondly, is that there was a change of ownership. A new owner may come in and want to actually have a low carbon source of heat, which would then be available to them because it had been built up to their doorstep. And thirdly, is that there would be, when there was a change of boiler, their current heating equipment expired, that would be an opportunity. The difficulty with that is that I don't think that people, including Aberdeen Heat and Power, would not invest money on such an open-ended scenario. I think that you and I were to take £100 out of our building society to invest in something. I think that we would need a greater certainty that that building was going to connect and provide the revenue stream in order to repay the capital investment that we had made.
Thank you. That's very useful. And I had a follow-up question based on the evidence we heard in the previous session. We heard about a fairly significant increase in the provision of heat demand from heat networks. Do you agree that? Do you think those projections are optimistic, or do you think they're quite realistic?
I think that they are realistic, but I would caveat that, or rather sort of refine it to say that the figure that was quoted in the Scottish Government memorandum based on their research suggests that it could be 12% of delivered heat by 2050. Now, that is across the country as a whole, because the heat networks tend to be an urban technology. The likelihood is that within towns and cities, that percentage would be higher.
Okay, and is there anything policy can do to help the wider distribution of this, or is it largely driven by the economics of the investment?
I think that overall it's largely driven by the economics of it, which in turn is actually driven by the density of buildings in a particular area, the mix of buildings, and the presence of an anchor load. Also, the presence of sources of waste heat, such as energy from waste plants, power stations, or ambient heat in terms of rivers, the sea, the land in terms of ground source heat pumps, these sorts of things. But all of these should be captured within the LHE's proposal of actually producing a heat network zone. You would actually encapsulate all of those to define the heat network zone, and it's that process that actually begins to de-risk the proposition, and therefore makes it much more attractive for an investor, whether it's public or private.
Okay, that's very helpful.
If I might follow up, Lockhart on one other point in terms of this obligation to connect. I think that there is a resistance in respect of certain kind of building owners in terms of competition law and things of this nature. And I think that a softer option would be if the bill included an obligation on those buildings to explain why they could not connect to a network. And in that way, it could bring out or force them into a situation where they have to engage in contractual negotiation with the heat network operator to justify their position.
Yeah, understood. That's very valuable feedback, Michael. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, well, and that brings us to the end. I think Richard Lyle would just like to come in. So, Richard, do you have a quick question to ask?
Yeah, trying to unmute. Wait now.
You're on mute. Should carry on.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself. Michael, basically, would you agree, just quickly, we've failed to exploit various other waste opportunities because of environmental concerns, and if we had more drive and determination, we could change much of this? Yes or no?
Are you referring to waste?
Yeah, you know, the problem, I won't bore you, I had one that my constituents were against, but you go to other cities and towns and other countries, they've got waste to heat plants. Have we failed to get the environmental concerns tackled?
I'm afraid to say, Richard, as I have to duck that one because I am a heat network person. I am not a waste management person, and so the decision on that is further upstream. That is down to people that know about such matters. However, if they decide to go down the energy from waste route, then I would be very pleased if they, and I believe it is SEPA policy nowadays, that they should be efficient as possible, which includes providing a heat offtake. If not immediately, within a certain amount of time, which I believe is about 5 years. That would then create the opportunity for a heat network operator to come in, capture that heat, and distribute it to the local community. But in terms of the decision on waste, that's not ours.
You did mention it. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Right, we're now sort of coming to the end, Michael, but I mean, we've covered a fair bit of ground, a lot of different questions, but can I just ask quickly, is there anything that you feel is missing from the bill? Anything that you would have liked to have seen included that isn't there?
I think, Michelle, is that I've actually covered those, the points that we really wish to see. One was to actually have some sort of reference to fuel poverty within the bill, and the second one was the issue that I was talking to with your colleague, Mr. Lockhart, about the obligation to connect.
Right, so just those two things that you really feel need to be on the face of the bill.
Yes.
Okay, well, in that case, given the time, I'm going to thank you for your time this morning. It's been very helpful, I think, to speak to somebody who's delivered and running a heat network, and obviously we're going to make a decision on our report in terms of our recommendation to Parliament, but I think the evidence you submitted in writing, the evidence you've given today has been very helpful. So thank you very much. And that completes our two panels for today and our public session. So as agreed at the beginning of this meeting, we're now going to move into private. So can I thank anybody who's watching and thank Broadcasting for supporting transmission of this meeting today. We will take a 10-minute break back at 17 minutes past 12. Thank you.